Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our event. I'm seeing the number of attendees rising up rapidly. I'll wait for a few more seconds before we officially commence the session. But thank you for being here. Okay, I see that we have already quite a lot of participants. That's great to see. I'll begin the session because I know we have quite a limited time frame, so I don't want to keep you for longer. So thank you for being here and welcome to the second event in our Zooming in on Solutions to the Affordability of Medicines series. Today, we will be zooming in on transparency of real pharmaceutical costs, which is organized by EPHA, GHA, and the European Alliance of Responsible R&D and Affordable Medicines. My name is Yera Matesh, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. I'm here with my colleague Marisa Veloso, who will be our hypermoderator, and I'll pass the floor to her to let you know what hypermoderation is.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Hello, everyone. My role as the hypermoderator is to moderate the conversation that is coming from you, the audience, either here on Zoom or on the chat or on Twitter using the hashtag affordability or tagging Matt's Alliance account. So throughout the event, you can put your questions in the Q&A feature here on Zoom. I'm going to collect these and we are going to address them during the Q&A session that is at the end of this event, where, well, we will give the floor to you to either put your questions or me, I will give them to the speakers. Throughout the event, I'm also going to be launching 3 polls, so please be ready to click your preferred answer. We also want to see why you're choosing a specific answer, so feel free to use the chat to interact with us. Let us know why you chose one answer, not the other, or just like to chats, drop your questions too. Before I pass the floor back to Irem, I think it would be nice to see who is there, who is out there. So I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your organization, why you're here today maybe, and why not your LinkedIn account. I think we can all stay connected after this event. I will start by sending a message in the chat. And when you're doing that, please make sure that you send it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your reply. I will start.
Okay, thank you a lot, Marisa. I think that's it from your side, no? If I'm not mistaken. Awesome. So now, before we kick off the event, I wanted to share some standard housekeeping rules with all of you and mostly our attendees, of course. Our event will last approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes, and it will be recorded. Your cameras and microphones, if you are part of the audience member, of course, are set to be off by default. But if you would like to ask any questions, as Marisa mentioned earlier, you can put it in the Q&A box or in the chat boxes down below. But if you would like to ask your questions in person when we come to the Q&A session of the event, feel free to raise your virtual hand and our technical team will unmute your microphone and will give you the chance to turn on your camera as well so that you can ask your question in person to the respective speakers in the team. So that could be nice to add a bit of personality to this. But if you prefer for us to read it, of course, just drop it in the chat and we will be happy to do that. And a quick housekeeping rule for our distinguished speakers. You're all given time slots for your presentation. We will be managing the time in the back with our technical team as well. But if you are running over more than 1-2 minutes, I will try to disrupt you to inform you that you need to please wrap up your points because we just need to make sure that we have enough time to cover all the speakers, all the important points, and also have room for the conclusions that we want to share at the end as well. And voila, these are the rules. We have very valuable speakers today who will share their experiences, knowledge, and opinion with all of us. And I would like to first give a very warm welcome to all of our speakers and kick off the event by inviting Elise Rodriguez, Advocacy Director of Global Health Advocates, to give her opening remarks and setting the theme.
Thank you very much. Greetings to speakers and participants. Thank you for joining this webinar on the issue of transparency or the lack of thereof of real pharmaceutical costs. A couple of words about GHA. Global Health Advocates is a French NGO, which mission is to carry out political advocacy in France and with the EU institution to ensure resources and policies are effectively addressing health inequalities. And one key area for work is to look at how research and innovation policies are designed and governed in order to maximize the public return and better societal impact. Global Health Advocate is also a happy member of the European Alliance for Responsible R&D and Affordable Medicines, who is co-hosting this webinar. Now to dive directly into the topic. In recent years, rapid scientific advancements have resulted in the production of a number of innovative life-saving treatments. And these health products, however, often come with high prices tags and prove inaccessible for people or countries in need. And it is important to stress here that issues in relation to medicines affordability are also, and not only an issue for developing countries, but also for high-income countries, where you see huge discrepancies in terms of access to proven medical devices. In general, there is a need for greater transparency in the pharmaceutical sector with regards to different aspects, like the pricings, like the financial incentives provided to the industry to perform research, and with regards to R&D costs. Although high prices are justified by the pharmaceutical sector as due to substantial costs and risk for R&D, increasing evidence shows that the prices of innovative medications and devices far exceed the R&D costs. And this conversation could be broadened to other key elements. And let me just share what we found, what a study, I would say, dated from October 2021 from the America's Health Insurance Plans found. They found that 7 out of 10 big pharma companies spent more on sales and marketing than R&D midst of the COVID-19 crisis. So these high costs are a significant barrier to access, causing inequities within and among states, and leading to high level of out-of-pocket expenditure in countries across all income levels. And the combination of high prices and the lack of transparency, as well as example of unscrupulous practice, has eroded stakeholder trust. This had led to questions about whether the profit margins should be considered acceptable. The high and unaffordable prices of these medications have prompted calls from different stakeholders for fair pricing models and increased transparency on the financing of drug development and the drug supply. Calls also to rebuild trust and to put an end to the asymmetry of information between states and pharmaceutical companies. And also, how can we make sure that we better understand whether prices are justified? Public health stakeholders, and notably states, would benefit from greater transparency on the entire drug supply chain and on costs, as today market failure are threatening the sustainability of their healthcare systems and access to medicines for the population. And this was recognized by the international community when the World Health Assembly adopted in 2019 a resolution to improve the transparency of market for medicines, vaccines, and health products. Now, 2 years after the adoption of the resolution, some progress have been made, including in France, in Italy, and at the EU level, with the adoption in November 2020 by the European Commission of the new Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe. And this strategy acknowledged this lack of transparency, in particular with regards to costs of publicly funded R&D. And this notably creates a regulatory framework to ensure access to affordable medicines in Europe. This is well said in the official document. So now we cannot afford to continue discussing the merits of such a resolution or such a call, and it's time to move beyond and to implement change. And that's exactly the purpose of the discussion today, I guess. And today's our speakers will share their perspective from their own point of view, and I'm sure they will help us to figure out how that change may happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise, for this very nice welcome to our second event. Now, before moving on, we want to start involving our audience already in the discussion, because I see there is a lot of chat is happening and we have a very engaged audience, so that's great. We've prepared 3 poll questions for this event to see the opinions of our audience on some of the key topics that we will be discussing, and we would already like to ask you the first one. Marisa, will you do the honors, please?
Thank you, Rem. Exactly. So we have the first question ready for you. You can see it already. The question goes like this. Do you think more transparency of pharmaceutical costs will enable more affordable medicines? Yes, no, or you don't know? The poll should be appearing on your screens right now. And feel free to let us know what you picked and why in the chat. I see that there's some activity. People are engaging, sharing their names, LinkedIn, even links. That's very good. You already received some questions in the Q&A feature too. Very happy to see that. Feel free to continue dropping questions and engaging. I'd also like to highlight that we are activating this event on Twitter. So feel free to engage with our posts using the hashtag affordability. Yes, see you there. I think we can close the poll soon. And we will also be showing the responses. So 69% of you have voted yes. I see a lot of people have voted. Thank you very much for engaging so much. Very exciting. We can maybe discuss later on why most of you think yes, but feel free to drop it already in the chat, and then we pick this up later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, and stay tuned for more questions to come. Now I would like to welcome Ms. Ellen Tohone, Director of Medicines Law and Policy. She will talk about the transparency of pharmaceutical costs after the 2019 World Health Assembly resolution. Welcome, Ellen. Please go ahead. Ellen, I think you are maybe on mute.
Yeah, I know, and so was the unmute button. So that was a bit of a challenge, but at least I can now. I should be able to move the slides, right? So that's something. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me and to this important seminar. And I have a brief period of time to make some remarks related to the WHO resolution. And I believe that some of the key people that made that resolution work are actually in the audience. So I'm a little intimidated by that, because I'm speaking in front of people who've actually made all of this happen. Now, if I could advance the slides, you would see my title slide. Maybe one of you could do it for me. So. Right. Oh, no, I'm back in control. I like to be in control. So this is the title of the seminar and my name. I always start with interest declaration. I work for Medicines Law and Policy. We're a group of self-employed people. We have a non-for-profit or organization. We work for academia, governments, UN. We have occasional grants to work on projects, and our work is open access and freely available on our website. If you want to stay informed, you can also sign up for our newsletter. So that was the promotional introduction. Now, the importance of price and cost transparency, and I saw someone in the chat just make the remark, you have to keep in mind that there's a huge difference between price transparency and cost transparency, and that is absolutely true. And that issue actually played out during the negotiations of the World Health Assembly resolution. I'll come back to that later. Now, why is it important? Transparency, price transparency for sure is good for consumers and patients. Secret prices are hardly ever low prices. There's a reason why there's such a drive to keep prices a secret, and that is of course part and parcel of strategies to keep the prices as high as possible, which is very much what the pharmaceutical industry strategy is. Transparency helps to correct the information imbalance, the imbalance between various buyers, but also the imbalance between the seller and the buyer. Those entities that sell medicines know the prices, but those who buy do not. It is very important, and this I really find a key point. Transparency is very important to ensure in informed policy debates, including the debates that are currently ongoing on how do you determine the level of research and development incentives? How do you determine when incentives are appropriate, when they are sufficient, or when they perhaps are going a little bit overboard? Very difficult to have a conversation about that if you don't have transparency with regard to those costs. Transparency further is important for good governance and for guarding democratic processes and the public confidence in these processes, both in policy processes, but also public confidence in the industry as such. We trust our governments to, for example, purchase medicines, but without actually knowing what the results of those purchase activities are, it is very difficult to have the accountability that is necessary in democratic societies. And of course, transparency is also important for research. I'm sure those of you in the academic world would agree with that. Now, a few words about the World Health Assembly Transparency Resolution that was adopted in 2019. I would like to draw attention to the fact that that did not come falling out of the sky. That was not a sudden event. There were several years before that, the theme of transparency emerged in various processes. And I've just list a few here on the slide. The United Nations High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines drew attention to the need for greater transparency. The Lancet Commission on Essential Medicines Policies had a section on transparency, called for greater transparency. The place where the discussion really became very intense and matured was at the World Health Organization's Fair Pricing Forum in South Africa that year, early 2019, where a group of countries with others came together to discuss transparency on pricing as costs, and that really helped to advance the subject at the World Health Assembly. The draft resolution was subsequently proposed and adopted at the Assembly in May 2009. The lead country for this was Italy. You see Italy here underlined and bold. The Italian delegation was very active. You see here the co-sponsors. That means those were the countries that were behind the first proposal, and the Assembly was adopted, or the resolution was adopted by the World Health Assembly. But I should note that there were 3 countries that disassociated themselves with this resolution. That was Germany and the UK, at the time, both still EU members. Of course, that is no longer the case, and Hungary, sorry, and Hungary. So those three European countries disassociated themselves. Nevertheless, the resolution moved forward, and it has become a World Health Assembly resolution. The resolution called for publicly sharing information on the net prices of health products. It further had a call on member states to support the dissemination of and access to the cost of clinical trials, and work collaboratively to improve reporting by suppliers of sales revenues, prices, units sold, marketing costs, subsidies, and incentives. So an overall greater transparency in the pharmaceutical sector. The most difficult subject was transparency on the cost of research and development. And I always find that a little bit surprising, because the cost of research and development is such an important driver for the belief by many politicians that these high medicines prices are necessary to finance research and development. But we're not allowed to know what the real cost of the research and development actually is. In addition, a large element of that discussion relates to the public financing in research and development, which is significant. It is very important, but if we don't know who pays what share, it is very difficult to then also have a good conversation about what further incentives should be and how high the prices actually should be. You end up in a situation where you'll never be able to determine when is enough, and that is of course the key with regard to the transparency of research and development cost. Now we had a chance to after the adoption of the resolution to look into whether legal measures have been taken by European governments. Of course, this was very shortly after the resolution was adopted, so not a great deal could be found, but countries that have been active are France, Italy, and Spain, and both France and Italy demanding more transparency with regard to the R&D cost. Our report further lists the online repositories of prices of medicines, but the problem with those is that they're often not the real prices. I guess that's why you put real in the title of this seminar. You can have list prices, but that doesn't really say much about what ultimately has been paid. So the net prices is very important. There have been some initiatives to experiment with pooled procurement in the European Union. And of course, since the purchase of the COVID-19 vaccines, that has even become a more interesting theme. And perhaps we can touch upon that in the discussion as well. And there are further in-country initiatives in the Netherlands, for example, of a clearinghouse methods where buyers amongst themselves share confidential pricing information. So even though they are bound by non-disclosure agreements, they amongst themselves share that information to level the playing field. So smaller hospitals will know what larger hospitals pay and vice versa. But the conclusion is that there's much scope to implement the World Health Assembly resolution, and of course, the revision of the EU pharmaceutical regulation offers an enormously important opportunity to look at these issues and to develop some new rules. One word about Switzerland before I close, because I'm running out of time, and I certainly don't want to be what was it? Were you going to disrupt me? Switzerland actually does publish net prices. You often hear, if you do that, if you are transparent about prices, that will have a detrimental effect on medicines pricing. I don't think that Switzerland is particularly known for its low prices, so this disclosure in that sense has not had that effect, but it certainly has had a positive effect in terms of the transparency. Now, a last 30 seconds on COVID-19. You cannot have a seminar these days on a health subject without discussing somewhat the pandemic, where we have seen there is the de-risking of the development of important pandemic countermeasures. Massive public financing has gone into the development of vaccines to combat the pandemic. Hugely important. Let me be absolutely clear about it. I think that is exactly what needs to happen. But you then have to also attach some conditions on how the knowledge that is developed with that public financing is used, and that has not really happened. But what has happened is that these products have become really very, very commercially enormously important products for the companies. If you just look at this statistic here, this is Pfizer's revenue in 2021. When the slide was made, I believe this was still projected revenue, but where you see that the vaccines account for almost half of the entire company's portfolio. Then the question arises, how much more public financing needs to go in there? But a more important question is actually, do we spend that public financing wisely? If you and nevertheless end up in a situation where vaccines are predominantly available in high-income countries and not in developing countries, and the know-how and the intellectual property necessary to produce these vaccines are not shared outside the trusted group of manufacturers these companies work with. So I know that that is a subject for an entirely different, well, multiple seminars, but there are lessons to be learned from the COVID vaccine development story. Now I'm definitely run out of time. So the conclusions, I've already touched on that. There's enormous scope for implementing the World Health Assembly Transparency Resolution. The EU pharma legislation revision is the chance to do that. It's not all about rules and regulation. It's also about developing new policies and new collaborations within Europe, for example, with regard to joint procurement and the sharing of prices amongst member states. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I used to have a thank you slide, but that someone somehow died in the email transfer. Over.
Thank you a lot, Ellen. It was very interesting to see your presentation, hear your thoughts, and there's been a lot of chat going on actually in the Zoom as well. I think we have a very engaged audience. This is definitely a very interesting topic for a lot of people. We can't wait to address some of these questions in the Q&A session later. But before that, I would like to continue the event by inviting our next speaker to the virtual stage, Mr. Momir Radulovic, Director of Slovenian Agency for Medicinal Products and Medicinal Devices. He'll be sharing with us his recent studies on transparency and affordability, a view from national authorities. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. And as a beginning, we need to foster a comprehensive, open and transparent debate on the paradigm shift in the pricing of medicines. And thank you for providing the forum that we do that. So I'm here, the representative of Slovenia. And Slovenia is a small country. We are not that able to implement some transparency resolutions, as Spain, Italy, and France did it, because we also face the constant challenges of accessibility we have to deal with. And clearly, this is also linked with affordability. If you move to the next slide, please. And the next one. Yes, so I will try to squeeze in my presentation in 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go in depth. So I would just like to start to say that pharmaceutical system at the EU level is well organized and developed. It sets these important standards to ensure high level of public health protection and the quality, safety, and efficacy of authorized medicines, as it builds on the scientific knowledge and harmonized marketing authorization procedures. But it leaves the challenge of access largely unattained, and this is subject to other internal market and competition rules, member state competencies. And if we talk about the European Health Union, we also need to think about solutions in this direction. And here I would just like to show you what is the current situation and analysis. We have these spiraling costs. Although the current budgets spending on pharmaceuticals is constant, is around 15% in developed countries, but what is worrying is that 11 countries represent half of the pharmaceutical market, according to IQVIA numbers to report. So this is 680 million for 11 biggest markets. That means that all the rest are rest of the world, or let's say in developing phase. And we have many new treatments on the market, but this is definitely, we have this spiraling in cost of new cancer treatments and gene therapy, which you all know. And there is an absence of connection between price of drugs, sales volumes, and clinical performance. And in spite of investments in R&D, we still have a lot of unmet needs, priorities, which are still unmet. And if you move to my next slide, please. So when we talk about what is currently in the system, so we really need to talk about what do we pay for, and this will become even more relevant when we talk about the true innovation that comes at certain risk and costs. But or do we all just pay for the higher business profits for Me Too products? We have a lot of medicines in the market which are Me Too products. They don't represent a big change in the treatment, so they are not changing the landscape of the disease, so this is what we want to see if we talk about innovation. And we still have different, let's say, different access issues, so we have drug shortages relating from that, because it's a profit and loss exercise, and we have these commercial imperatives like in drug trials or even in managed entry agreements. But just to summarize, the current system is dysfunctional and new drugs are out of reach for many patients, and that's why we need to look for the solutions, how to make not access but equal treatment outcomes for patients priority. Next slide, please. I would just touch base the pharmaceutical strategy, and this is the courtesy of Andrei Risch slide. So this is, I believe this will be also presented, but we have healthcare budgets that are limited, and high prices in medicines have impacts for healthcare system. And there is also a lot, much more complex questions of inequalities in access to health treatment, and of course, moreover, of outcomes of patients. And we all would like to have, so I mean all stakeholders, we would like to create future-proof regulatory framework for supporting innovation. So on one side, to have still innovation in place, that we will have new treatments, or let's say that we will look for the cure of the diseases, and on the other side, that we will be able to pay for this as a society. Next slide, please. So another slide. So we answer to those questions should be also developed with appropriate strategy for affordable medicines. And in this context, it is reasonable to expect a fair price. Not only will the public money is put into research, which in fact can be an important incentive if utilized correctly for real innovation addressing unmet needs, but also because the medicinal products are not like any other products. I would just like to point out, we're not talking about the commodities, we're talking about necessities, and they are in fact necessary, and it should not be a reverse argument for their higher or extreme costs. Quite the opposite, the commercial interest is legit, but we have to find or work towards current limitations that we have on the specificity of the product that aims to respond on health needs. Next slide, please. So we will have a legislation change, we will have 3 basic acts in change, and that definitely we should talk about how to change system for the good. And some opportunity for change will come, as said, this year, and announce revision of the basic pharmaceutical legislation, and then of course pediatric and orphan. And we should also address the current existing incentives, because incentives influence the type of innovation we have. And I believe we need to improve the existing forms of non-patent protection granted on medicines, which are set in the EU regulation and also in the current market. But to what extent the incentive system, and that's my personal opinion, by being relatively generous, this may also have disincentivized more challenging innovation in more complex and challenging problems of unmet need. For example, we have this high risk, there is less commercial interest, or failure rates are extremely high. And one very valid question is actually, do we have a valid critical endpoints, or do we have a right comparators in trials? So definitely we need to have a right balance between incentives and profits too, in order to stimulate innovation. And probably even more difficult question is the right patent protection policy, but this is also for other discussion. Next slide, please. So I will also join with the opinion that we should attach conditionalities to both national and European public funding, because as said, balance is important between incentives and profits. And we need to ensure that criteria and process for priority setting in healthcare are explicit, and that they're transparent enough, and of course there are a clear link between priorities and national pricing. Because for instance, in oncology, we already have some very treatable cancers like breast cancer or prostate cancers, but we have a lot of let's say different cancers, where the cancer survival of 5 years is still 10, 15, 20%, and this is not good enough. And that's what I mean when we talk about priorities in healthcare. And next slide, please. Then, of course, we should also talk about the definition on unmet medical need versus therapeutic or what is societal need. So there is a report from one Belgian authority, that we should talk about unmet need if really we don't have any alternative on the market. But many times we have different therapeutic options. At least they get some supplemental therapy. But hopefully the criteria how we set what is unmet and the level of, let's say, severity of the disease will also be embedded in future legislation. Next slide, please. So, and I cannot, as we talk about transparency, I think while legislation and policy create environment, we also need the active role of governments and the European Commission here. So, and we need to find solutions for this hindered access in some parts of the EU market, also with new tools and mechanisms such as joint procurement possibilities to be organized as this is currently happening. But also we need to talk about different new treatment possibilities, like maybe joint treatment facilities. But if I go to the transparency, I think the transparency is important for many reasons. And for the reason that, of course, to address the problems properly, and of course, I think we need to talk about most relevant policies and incentives because it's in our public health interest to address really the needs that we have. And transparency directive is done for the public stakeholders, and I think the industry could and should be part of it, and I think after 32 years we should revise this in future, that we talk about changing the transparency directive. So some years ago, the attempts to amend transparency directive failed, but I don't think this should be an excuse to do any further attempts. And of course, we need to provide structures, control systems, and incentives to either reward responsible or a high ethical industrial behavior or penalize it. And then if I go to the next slide, and this is my last slide. So this is, I think, pharmaceutical strategy very much welcomed, has resulted in this new impetus to cooperation of national competent authorities of pricing and reimbursement and public health cares. And we hope that this transparency directive will be, as said, looked again. And any reform of transparency directive would require widening its current scope, which needs to include both sides, as already said. And we definitely would like to talk about solutions. I don't think we can easily get to the price, what's the real cost of the prices. That's why we need to build in the solutions. So we need to talk what happens if we have, for instance, 32 billion of sales of Pfizer vaccine, which one big part is in Europe. Do we have a threshold on the life cycle of medicines? We have medicines in the market that already gained 100 billion of sales in their life cycle. So that's why we need to embed these solutions. What happens if the threshold is achieved, and then to bring in different solutions like compulsory licensing or even model on fair pricing. And just my last slide, I think I will just end here. So innovation does need to be costly. It can be affordable. One thing that we did with the ESSI presidency was a focus on repurposing. And I will just give you some food for thought on my next slide. These are the recommendations of EU panel. I think we should all strive to work in this direction, and we should change. We should have this paradigm shift. If you move to the next slide. So I think I will just end with this: the medical needs, not financial needs, should determine access to medicines, and the drugs must be affordable to society. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Radlovic. It was an interesting presentation. And again, like before, we have a lot of comments and conversation happening on the chat function. I noticed that someone's actually put their hand up to ask a question, but we will keep that for the end of the session. We will have a Q&A with all of our attendees and panelists. So if you could please wait until that moment, that would be great. Now I understand we actually have another poll question for our audience. So I will hand over to Marisa for that.
Thank you, Irem. Yes, this is our second poll, and it goes like this. Do you think regulators know enough about the price determinants of new drugs to be able to price them fairly? Let us know if you agree. Yes, they do know enough. Or if no, they lack transparency of key elements. Or maybe you don't know. Indeed, there's a lot of discussion happening in the chat. So feel free to let us know why you choose yes, no, or maybe no answer. It would be very interesting, add a bit to the debate. I see the hands are still up. You can keep them up and we will just like unmute you at the end of the session during the Q&A and you'll be able to speak. I also got a couple, 2 questions in the Q&A and I want to let you know that feel free to continue dropping questions there in using the future Q&A. I'm also wanted to highlight that we will be sharing the recording of this event afterwards, as well as the slides. So no worries, I had that a couple of times in the chat. We will share that with you afterwards. And I think we can close the chat, the poll, and show you the answers. So most of you have said no, they lack transparency of key elements, 73%. Some people do think yes, they do know enough, and a few don't know. Let us know why. I would be interested for the ones that said yes, why you think they do know enough. Thank you very much. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Marisa. We have our third speaker now, Ms. Anne Hendricks, who is working for the Belgian mutual fund Solidaris, a member of AIM, the International Association of Mutual Benefit Societies. We heard the view of the authorities from Mr. Radulovic earlier. Now, Ms. Hendricks will be sharing with us her presentation on transparency and affordability from a national payer's viewpoint. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Yes, I have control. Thanks a lot to give the opportunity to AIM, which represent payers from 30 countries, of which 20 in Europe, to give our view on transparency. And I would like to go a bit further than the 2 previous speakers about, we all agree that there should be transparency, but now I would like to raise the question, would transparency make a difference for payers? And in order to answer to this question, we should dig in a little bit into the current system. We have approached it already a bit with Mamir, but today, how does the system work? We have a very complex model, the so-called value-based pricing models. They bear no link at all with the cost. And how do they work? We start negotiating with prices that are set by the companies on whatever base they want. Most of the time, they try to maximize revenue. And then the payers enter into the play and try to negotiate those prices on mainly 2 aspects, the aspects of efficacy of the medicine and the aspect of the cost, trying to limit the price according to our ability or willingness to pay. But very often, it's not a real ability or willingness to pay, it's a reluctancy to refuse. As Mamir mentioned, there are lots of unmet medical needs or medical, therapeutical, societal, but it's extremely difficult for payers to refuse a drug, even if we don't agree with the price. So what's the result of this system? It's that we have very high, totally unjustified prices. And I would like in this presentation to take the example of Sovaldi because it has been very well documented and it's very interesting as an illustration. Sovaldi in most of the high-level countries has been reimbursed at around 40,000–50,000 euro for a treatment, for a 12-week treatment. Knowing that 1% of the global population and of European population is affected by hepatitis C, this meant for Europe only 200 billion just to treat hepatitis C in Europe. So the question is, would transparency on the cost make a difference? And could it have made a difference for Sovaldi? We know a lot about R&D cost for Sovaldi. Everybody knows that Gilead purchased Pharmaceutical that had been developing Sovaldi for $11 billion. But we also know that the investment in research from Pharmaceutical was very low. It was below $300 million. So we know that the actual R&D expenses were not that high. We know also that the production cost for a chemical drug like this antiviral drug is very low, below 30 euro for a treatment. And we had some of that information when we negotiated the prices for Sovaldi, and we didn't know how to deal with that information. When you get that information, how do you put it into the current system. You can't do anything with it. So I don't think transparency would really make a difference, but I think that setting transparent and fair rules would make a difference. And as payers, what we need is objective, transparent, and fair prices. I think the discussion about fair prices is very far, and we have quite a broad consensus on what fairness means for prices. The WHO has been working a lot on that, and there is not too much discussion, but the discussion now is how we can reach that goal. And for us, we think that there are two major things to reach that goal. First of all, we need to restore the balance in negotiation. We are really too weak confronted to the pharmaceutical industry. We need to act as one big market, as one European market, for instance. And the second very important element is that we need to restore a link with the reality of the cost. So how can we do that on a practical base? AIM has been thinking about that, and we have proposed a model that is a very concrete tool to achieve that goal. The model proposes a way to calculate a European fair price, and it's based on three very important elements. One is the fact that we use both the cost for the company, but also the value of the drug. The second one is that we have objective criteria. And the third one, and I will come back to it later, is that we are not captive of full transparency. If we go a little bit more into the model, in the details of the model, for the R&D cost, we use in the model the real amount spent by the companies that they want to declare, with a ceiling at 2.5 billion. But immediately in the example of Sovaldi, you can see the important question of methodology. What would we put in our model? Do we use one part of the $11 billion spent to purchase Pharmasset, or do we have to consider only the real R&D cost that Pharmasset spent for the discovery of several drugs? So that's for us a very important debate that we have to have. And as I mentioned, the model, one principle of the model is that we don't want to be captive of full transparency. This is why we propose an alternative. If we don't have access to the figures of real cost, we propose to use a lump sum, a global amount of 250 million that we allocate for the discovery of a new drug. For the other parameters, we use a little bit the same principle. For production, we also have either the real production cost or a lump sum. For sales and medical information and basic profit, we use fixed percentages. And for the last parameter, which is extremely important, which we call the innovation bonus, we use the value of the product. It's very important that the price will still incentivize good, interesting innovation for the patient. And this is why we give additional bonus up to 40% if the drug has a positive and important effect for patients. If we come back to our example of hepatitis C drug, if we use our model with the parameter I just explained, the cost, the fair price for a treatment would have been less than 1,000 euros. So the 38 to 60 thousand euro treatment was not fair, and what would have been fair would have been 900 euro only. So you might say, this is not realistic. We can't use that kind of model. I mean, the prices are too low. I mean, there is no way we can use it. Well, some did use it. Our very brave Netherlands colleague used it. They first analyzed the model, slightly adapted it, and published a paper about the use of the model for a repurposed drug out of mexiletine. And they showed that the fair price would be way, way below the current list prices. Based on that model and that publication, the Minister of Health from the Netherlands decided not to reimburse the drug. So this is a real first practical application of the model. So we believe that the way forward on transparency should involve those two elements. A discussion on the methodology, as I described quite clearly. I think for R&D, it's really urgent that we decide what we consider as acceptable R&D, but also at the same time that payers start experiencing the models to try to negotiate with new starting points. There are some models that have been published, but I strongly recommend that you go have a look at the fair pricing calculator developed by AIM. This is a tool that we developed based on the model I just presented, and with some quite technical information, but I think most of the audience here is able to get that information. You can calculate a fair price, and you can use this fair price as a base for negotiation in the price of new drugs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Hendricks, for your inputs and your presentation. The chat box is going wild. I'm very happy to see the interaction. There are actually a lot of questions to our panelists, to our audience members asking each other. We would love to pick up these questions and address some of these during the Q&A. We hope we will have enough time. So because of this reason, I'm just jumping on to introduce our next speaker quickly. I would like to invite on virtual stage Mr. Harold Mish, the Deputy Head of Units of Medical Products, Quality, Safety, Innovation at DG Sante. He will be presenting to us the new pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, going from transparency to affordability.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, of course, I would like to thank all the organizers of the European Public Health Alliance for their invitation to today's webinar and to today's discussion on the transparency of real pharmaceutical costs. First slide, please. First slide, please. Yeah. We all know that transparency does not exist, and I believe the topic of today's webinar is really very timely, as the interesting discussions are showing. So discussions on transparency of pharmaceutical costs, that's of course also a topic and part, and it will be part of the Commission work. As you can see here, in fact, in 2019, our President Ursula von der Leyen instructed in her mission letter to look at ways to help ensure that Europe has the supply of affordable medicines to meet its needs. And since then, affordability has become an important part of the Commission's work. And the topic of affordability, of course, includes also the one of transparency of costs. Next slide, please. So to set a little bit the context, as you know, in 2020, and this was already mentioned, the European Commission published its Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe. The Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe is a very broad strategy. It covers the full life cycle of medicines with all its dimensions, and there are many: fostering research of innovation, supporting a competitive and innovative European pharmaceutical industry, covering unmet needs, ensuring access and the supply of medicines, and of course, importantly, also ensuring affordability of medicines. So the costs of pharmaceuticals, and here I refer to the costs of developing, the cost of manufacturing pharmaceuticals, and of course, the potential transparency of these costs, touches on most of these areas in one way or another. So costs are crucial. In fact, when costs and risks are too high, research by companies may actually never happen. And sometimes the public will step in and fund that research that would otherwise not happen. And if the research does happen and the costs run very high, then of course this can lead to very high prices. And if the prices get too high, the medicine may not be affordable to the health systems, and then also not available to patients. And of course, as the discussion has shown, sometimes also prices may be very high, although the R&D costs were not that high. And in this case, this can raise serious concerns for public health, in particular when a medicine that patients would need is not affordable, although it could be. And this even when taking into account fully the need to reward innovation. Next slide, please. So in recent years, as Anne's example of Sovaldi illustrates, some medicines have been offered at very high prices. And moreover, as Anne's example of Sovaldi also illustrates, there can be high value acquisitions of promising pipelines. Sorry, next slide, please. No, the one before. The one before. Yeah. No, the next one, please. So there can be high value acquisitions of promising pipeline products. When high prices are paid for pipeline products, it can, of course, also have an important impact on the price level that is then charged to health systems. So we are sometimes experiencing that medicines become more and more unaffordable. And when this affects the lives of our citizens and public health, as it often does, it is a natural step to ask the question, what are the costs of R&D and production? And if you do not know the answer to that question, the next question is obviously, should there be transparency of such costs? And of course, we wouldn't have today's discussion if we had that transparency. Of course, there's also the other very important question of the value of a medicine. It is a bit of a different point, but also a very important one. But in any case, of course, when evidence, real life evidence doesn't show clearly that the value is there, and then the company requests a high price, then of course the issue of a justification of that high price becomes again very pressing. So the pharmaceutical strategy has taken up all of these issues and points, and in relation to the lack of transparency, and in particular in relation to R&D costs, it has noticed that a better understanding and greater clarity is fundamental as a basis for policy debates on the pricing of niche medicines and a fair return on research contributions. So next slide, please. So of course, I should add that our policies are all about finding the right balance. That's the right balance between innovation, access, affordability, and availability, because only if all of those come together, the patient will in the end have access to the treatment. And it is, of course, the patient that matters. Now, next slide, please. Please allow me to walk you now through the different actions of the Commission regarding cost transparency. And as you will see, most of the discussions still have to happen. So the first point that I need to mention is one of the flagship initiatives of the Pharmaceutical Strategy is the cooperation of the national authorities for pricing and reimbursement and the public payers. We refer to this as NCAPA, and one of the work streams of the NCAPA is on transparency, costing, and pricing principles. Now, please note that the work in that group is driven by the member states and it is facilitated by the Commission. And the Commission, of course, facilitates the work also with the help of other tools, such as the EU for Health program. So next slide, please. So the second point that I would like to mention is that under the EU for Health program, there was a grant given to the OECD to deliver a set of different work packages. And one of them is to work on the increase of transparency regarding public pharmaceutical research funding and how then the research allocation is happening in the global R&D-based pharmaceutical industry. Next slide, please. And a third point is the EU for Health package that was just adopted a few days ago. And here also the objective of one of the actions is to improve transparency on the cost of medicines by filling knowledge gaps of costing methods. And then there is the objective to improve the verification of cost claims. And finally, there's also the objective to identify evidence generation needs for the NCAPA regarding the life cycle of a medicine and to improve transparency of data. And all of this, of course, has the aim to make costing methods and principles, of course, more transparent. Then the next slide, please. Momi already mentioned we have the review and others too of the basic pharmaceutical legal framework. And here the pharmaceutical strategy had already raised the question whether in the review of the system of incentives to ensure patient access, there should be a greater conditionality of incentives. And in fact, this question was now also asked to the public in the last public consultation on the basic pharmaceutical legal framework. And the question that was asked was, to support innovation and as a condition for certain incentives, would it be a good idea to impose transparency on R&D costs and public funding? And I hope that many of you responded to our public consultation, which is now closed. In any case, the results will be available quite soon. Now, next slide. And finally, of course, there is the Oslo initiative of the WHO, of the European Office, which is designed to increase transparency also in relation to certain costs and to make medicines affordable. It was already mentioned and discussed before. We are involved in that process. And in fact, we are just coming out of a meeting from this morning with the scientific committee. So there's a lot going on this issue of transparency of costs. But again, as I already explained, a lot of the processes of discussing this topic, they are still very much in front of us. So we are very much looking forward to our discussion and to learn from you and from today's discussion. And we will feed this into our processes. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Miche, for your precious contribution as well. Now we would like to ask our audience to participate in our last and final poll question. Over to you, Marisa.
Thank you very much, Irene. So here's our last poll. Thank you so much for participating into the others. The question is, what do you think should the Commission particularly focus on in implementing the EU pharmaceutical strategy? So you have recommendations for the pharmaceutical sector to be more transparent, mandatory obligations for the pharmaceutical sector to enhance transparency, nothing at all, or you don't know. Thank you very much for engaging, for having being so active in the chat too. It's really nice to see different perspectives. Let us know why you picked one answer or the other. We are also online on Twitter. Use the hashtag affordability if you want to engage with us. We are posting some specific super quotes that you are taking during the events, and we'd love to see you engaging with it too. Now we are slowly but surely coming to the end of the event, and I see some hands still raised, so we will address and unmute you at the end of the session. Some questions also being addressed in the chat already, so we won't cover those again. And I have a few questions in the Q&A feature. Thank you very much for that. I think we can close the poll and show the answers straight away. So most of you think that mandatory obligation for the pharmaceutical sector to enhance transparency is needed. Let us know why and if you agree or not in the chat. Thank you very much. Now, I think we can move on to the Q&A session. And for this, we have some people that have their hands raised, but also some people that put questions in the Q&A. So I think I will unmute Charlotte Kofian. Maybe you'd like to ask a question directly to our speakers.
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Good. Yeah. So I had a question about obviously cost transparency for all our speakers, because I represent a patient organization in France, and as you know, access issues are not only around very high prices of certain medicines, but also around shortages of medicines, which is an increasing problem in Europe, and we know that. And I was wondering whether cost transparency could not be a part of the solution to both problems, because if we had cost transparency around the cost of new medicines and the cost of older medicines, it would be an opportunity to rebalance the prices of older medicines, because the industry often complains about the fact that shortages of medicine are often due to the fact that older medicines have very low prices and not sufficient in order to support their cost. So since the budget of medicines is not extendable without any limits, it would be a possibility to rebalance the prices of new medicines and all medicines. And I would like to know what our panelists think of that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Do you have a specific panelist in mind, or maybe one of you?
Maybe Anne Hendricks or Mamia.
Yeah, I can give some elements of answer. Yeah, we agree that transparency is in both directions, that some products are too expensive, but some products are way too low. As a payer, in the same commission, it's the same committee, sometimes we have to discuss about the price of a new drug, and one 30-day packaging will cost 5,000 euro. And we have to discuss the price raise of a drug, which is 3 euro and is requesting a 100% raise up to 6 euro. So we are fully aware as payers that there is a problem with older drugs, and that, yes, transparency could be a solution to better document this profitability problems of all drugs, and try to find a more permanent solution.
Thank you very much, Anne. Would any other panelists like to add something here?
Yeah, I can add.
Quickly, thank you.
Yeah, transparency is a long-standing issue. I think we need to put provisions in place, like legal provisions and solutions in place, that we would make this possible. For instance, if we have a drug shortage for an old drug that no one wants to produce, so we have one API on the world, and it has, for instance, difficulties in quality, I think we need to find a way to have this in Europe, So in terms of I will just refer to the council conclusions that were adopted by Health Minister last December. For this kind of situation, for medicines where there is no commercial interest, I think we should have a publicly financed manufacturing facilities in place to achieve this access to older drugs, because we see these old drugs disappearing from the market because they're not profitable enough. And these kind of solutions we need to make it happen in the legislation change, and to get actually political attention to it.
Yeah, and if I may add, the European Commission has been involved in what we refer to as the structured dialogue, another flagship initiative under the Pharmaceutical Strategy, and as part of this dialogue, the supply chains and security of supply and shortages are being assessed. In addition, there's also DG GROW that is active on the industrial side, and having a look at supply chains and security of supply, and open strategic autonomy for the EU to increase the security of supply. So there's already a lot of work that is going on there. And of course, in that context, in particular, if there is a justified claim of a company producing an old medicine, that it is not earning a sufficient return, that it would otherwise exit the market, there could be reflections about whether such companies should be disclosing the costs or cost increases that they are struggling with in order to justify a price increase that allows them to stay in the market.
Thank you, Harold. I hope this answered the question. We are getting a lot of questions, so I will quickly jump to the next one. And for this, I would like to unmute Helen Collis from Politico, that has had a question right from the beginning. Helen, up to you.
Hi, thank you so much for carrying this out today. I'm interested in to what extent the barriers to affordable and accessible medicines are at the member state level versus the EU level. And given that we have this huge pharmaceutical strategy going through and review of the pharmaceutical legislation, to what extent can the EU really have a big impact on timely access to affordable medicines? And so I'd like to address this to Harold Misch, please, at the Commission, and perhaps get a member state opinion too from Momir Radulovic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I can just refer you back to the pharmaceutical strategy that is carefully drafted in many different ways. As you have rightly pointed out, the competence, for instance, for pricing reimbursement is not with the European Commission, but the European Commission can facilitate processes and discussions that may then feed into the policy making on a national level. So indeed, it is of course clear that not all tasks are with the EU, but part of the tasks are, and a very important part is currently under the review, which is the general pharmaceutical legislation and the legislation for pediatrics and orphans.
Thank you, Harold. I think Helen would like to add something here too.
Oh,
it was.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to just draw attention to the fact that the EU pharmaceutical regulation is very generous in giving incentives to the industry that are most of them are based on granting market exclusivities or market monopolies, and of course that leads directly to higher drug prices. So there's a lot that can be fixed there. Further, Mr. Wish already mentioned the orphan drug regulation that is rather open to abuse, where companies that have hardly invested anything in the development of the drug nevertheless benefit from 10-year market exclusivity, which inevitably leads to higher prices of medicines, often of old molecules. So there's a lot that can be done there. There are also serious barriers in the pharmaceutical regulation to member states' ability to intervene. One of the speakers mentioned compulsory licensing, for example. That could be an effective measure or an effective threat to help bring prices down. But if you cannot then subsequently register the generic medicine because of data and market exclusivity granted through EU legislation, then that tool becomes mute. So there's a lot that can be and needs to be fixed in the regulation itself, in addition to policy changes and policy measures that countries could take amongst themselves in the area of procurement. Over.
Thank you very much. I hope this replied to your question, Helen. I really want to address a few more other questions, so I will move on to Luca Libasi. The floor is to you. On mute.
Yes.
Oh, we hear a little echo.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to thank all the speakers and for the excellent presentation. As you know, I've been involved. I was the lead negotiator for the WHA transparency resolution, and at the time the Director General of the Italian Medicine Agency. So I know some of the speakers, not all, but all of them I think have done a great work in presenting the issues. And I wanted to also thank the organizer for raising the possibility, or at least presenting the opportunity to have this discussion. So a lot of things have been said and have been well presented. So it would be very much complicated to add more to that. Just a couple of points from my side is, for example, that the general concept that we all share the need and the responsibility to contribute to developing healthy, competitive, and innovative pharmaceutical markets, or market for health products. And the real question for me is whether or not the current system is the best way to achieve this objective. And there are several elements regarding transparency that have been discussed during this webinar. And of course, I think we can all agree that there are many elements in the overall value chain of health products that would deserve to have a little bit more information to allow payers to be on a better footing to be able to recognize the right price and the right value of pharmaceuticals. And I would not personally focus too much on individual elements of transparency. All of them are important, but I think it's a journey that we need to undertake and to start building a better symmetry of information in order to enable both parts, the payers on one side and the sellers on the other, to contribute to develop a healthy, competitive, and innovative market. And for this reason, I just wanted to present one very recent case that it can be actually quite interesting for this discussion. And this is related to a new drug, a new product. Actually, it's a monoclonal antibody. It's called Evusheld. I don't know whether people have heard of it. It's been developed by AstraZeneca. Its technical name is AZD7442. And it's the first product that has been developed for pre-exposure prophylaxis for COVID-19. Now, why am I proposing this example is the fact that we have reached the point during the pandemic where I think and I fear that we are losing even more grounds in terms of enabling all actors, starting from doctors who are prescribing drugs, allowing them to be well informed for the use of products. And the reason why I'm taking the example of Evusheld is that because it's been approved by the FDA for pre-exposure prophylaxis for COVID-19, and pre-exposure, not so. It's not like other monoclonal antibodies that have been approved for post-exposure, but this is the first one that has been approved with this indication, and the indication is actually for immunosuppressed patients. So although AstraZeneca announced the results of their key clinical trial results in August through a press release, because this is something that has become the trend, and presented updated data at the ID Week 2021 in late September. Actually, detailed findings had not yet been published when AZD was approved by the FDA. So, in reality, only 196 of the more than 5,000 patients unvaccinated on the clinical trial had compromised immune system. So, and this gives us an example of how little information has been shared within the scientific community. For this example shows us actually that doctors are not even placed in the best possible situation in order to be able to ascertain which patients would benefit most from this drug. And this is just because the only information available has been through the press releases and not through published information in peer-reviewed journals. So to me, transparency means starting from the sharing all information that is available from clinical trials. And we know that we have a long way to go in order to be able to access information on clinical trial results in every country in Europe, despite a mandatory requirement by the European Commission to ensure that all clinical trials publish and report, not publish, but report their results. So starting from being able to establish the value of the drug is not possible at this point in time because too many clinical trial results are lacking. So we have a lack of transparency starting from clinical trial results, clinical trial cost, because we have been talking about R&D cost for throughout this webinar, but the actual clinical trial cost, at least the clinical trial cost, would already be very useful in terms of policy decisions that needs to be made. And then covering all other aspects, including and then ending up on the transparency on the actual price of health products. So I would like to stress the fact that we need to treat transparency as a comprehensive package that needs to apply to the whole value chain of health products, not just uniquely some individual elements, but we need to work together to increase transparency so that policymakers can make appropriate decisions, payers can make appropriate decisions, patients can make appropriate decisions, and we all carrying the responsibility to develop a healthy, competitive, and innovative market. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you. I wanted to take a few more questions, but we are running late. So if you still have questions left, the ones that are raising hands, please drop them in the Q&A and we will reply in writing. So you'll get an answer to your questions. We'll do our best to do that now, while Rosa will be presenting the closing remarks now. So leaving the floor to Rosa.
So thanks very much to everyone that has stayed even over time. So I think we expected an interesting discussion, but certainly this has exceeded everyone's expectations. So I think I'm also talking on behalf of all the co-organizers. I would just like to close with a few insights. Can you hear me well? Sorry, there was some echo.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I want to just close with very few insights because a lot was said and actually very happily shared, and many questions and many different views on other stakeholders too. So skyrocketing prices are of course a huge problem for medicines because high prices affect patients, but those that need to pay out-of-pocket expenses, but they also affect national payers and the sustainability of health systems. And we also heard from all the speakers that there are not easy solutions. Society, individual patients need truly innovative as well as older generic medicines that can help them. But by them, I also mean us, because we're all patients at some point. So we need mechanisms to ensure that medical innovations are incentivized, that's clear. But innovations also need to be affordable. So there is no value in innovations if they don't reach their end users, which are patients. So affordable medicines are crucial for everyone, but how do we get there? We heard that a fair price, as defined by the WHO, is one that is affordable for health systems, for patients, but at the same time provides sufficient market incentives for industry to invest in new innovations and in innovative medicines. We saw the effects of the pandemic too, and we heard that how important, but how difficult it is to keep track of the huge public investments that were made for biomedical R&D. And yet we also see that global unequal access to COVID vaccines and treatments, which is also very revealing of this lack of tracking, lack of information to achieve fair pricing. So that cannot happen, obviously, without some sort of transparency. And we heard here that transparency is not only about prices, but it's also about cost. It's about R&D costs, and it is about production costs. So things are clearly more complicated. But we need transparency because this information is needed to achieve vital pricing decisions and to achieve that balance, fair pricing that everyone mentioned this afternoon. So we heard about these negotiations, these discussions that initiated in the WHO Pricing Forum that culminated in a World Health Assembly resolution. And we were so lucky to have also Luca, who gave us some insights from that angle too. But we also heard that from our speakers, who are very knowledgeable. And why was so difficult to get through those negotiations? It was difficult because, of course, we have different stakeholders and everyone has added their views. That's also something that was very interesting in the chat and in the questions that were posed here. But why do we need that? And the main reason is that the pharmaceutical market lacks transparency. Information, we all know, that is power, and public payers, the public at large right now, currently doesn't have enough information to estimate that fair pricing. So we heard the status quo that is affecting national authorities and national health systems across Europe. And we heard that it's very difficult to get to this, to use these current tools that are detached from cost, for instance, value-based pricing. We also heard that, I mean, there's a little bit of light here because there are practical tools that have been developed and that can help us to get there. So the European Fair Pricing Calculator is offering this practical alternative. There are also opportunities to improve the status quo. At EU level, for instance, with the EU for Health program that supports further cooperation and exchange of knowledge between member states. In the context also of the revision of the EU pharma legislation. And there is also great opportunities to collaborate within the WHO and in other discussion forums. So I would just like to close the webinar to say that this was a great opportunity to kickstart the conversation. So we are not finishing here. We did this conversation, or we started it again in the wake of new evidence recently gathered about transparency and about the lack of implementation of transparency at national level across Europe. New problems that are confronting national authorities and national payers, new tools being developed, and new opportunities that are being brought by the EU Pharmaceutical Strategy and the revision of the pharma legislation. So my invitation today is really, we should keep on discussing transparency. Even if we don't agree on many things, we should keep this discussion with as many stakeholders as possible. And this should include, of course, European national authorities, patients, consumers, civil society, and industry, both the developers of innovative products and also the developers of generics, the producers of generics, because we need to find and implement solutions that address these complexities and these urgencies in this area. And we need to do this because otherwise society and individual patients will not be able to afford the medicines they need. So on behalf of all the co-organizers, I just want to thank our brilliant speakers, the audience for these interventions, comments and live questions in the chat and beyond. And a special thanks also to the technical team that made this conversation possible.
Thanks a lot, Rosa, for your closing remarks and your final words. I want to echo what you just said. I want to thank all the speakers for their great contribution and their very interesting presentations. I also want to thank our audience who've been extremely interested and vocal and engaging. And I would like to thank you for sticking around for the past hour or so. I know we are running over time, but it was very, very interesting to see the conversation. We still have quite a lot of unanswered questions in the Q&A, and we also have a lot of discussion that's happened on the chat. We will try to come back to you and answer some of these questions perhaps offline, because we have to wrap up the webinar, unfortunately. I know you all have stuff to go to as well. We'll try to continue the conversation offline. And as you know, there's also a conversation happening online on Twitter if you would like to contribute, or maybe start some of those conversations there as well if you feel comfortable doing so. If you enjoyed this event and you would like to listen in for more views on this topic of affordability of medicines, don't forget to sign up for our next event of the series, which will take place on the 25th of January, exactly 1 week from now. The registration link and the program of the event are available on the website. And I think someone from our team will also drop it in the chat here as well. We would love to see you there as well and hear more from you in our next session. Until then, have a very good evening. And thank you once again for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.